Hello again and welcome back. So, in this session, I want to discuss some marketing research techniques. So, the agenda for this session is to discuss two broad classes of marketing research techniques. So, we'll talk about qualitative and then quantitative. So, when firms conduct market research, they are either doing qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis. So, the book actually does a very nice job of discussing the various qualitative analysis tools or various approaches to gathering data. So I'll keep my discussion on these techniques brief. I will instead some time on the quantitative analysis techniques, which I feel that the text does not do an adequate job of. Okay. So, in particular, I want to spend some time talking about regression analysis, and I will show you an application of how data collected through surveys can be used to construct perceptual maps, which comes in very handy when you're making product decisions. So, that is the agenda for this session. But before we dive into the different techniques, I want to pose a managerial problem so that we can then relate how market research and the data collected in that process can help shed light or address that problem. So, for example, as a manager, you might find that the sales of your product are sluggish, and you might wonder about what you could do to make your product sales better or what you could do to improve your sales. Now, you might start by asking why the product is not doing as well as it was earlier. And to answer this question, you will need to analyze data that allows you to relate the sales of your product to factors that you think may influence your sales, such as the marketing mix of your product and those of your competitors. Okay, so the data sources that you might have access to might be what is called secondary data. That is data that already exists. So secondary data can be internal to the firm with the information technology we currently have. Now, most stores, for example, have scanner technology and store cards that allows them to track and log the purchases made by customers in every visit. Okay, so this kind of data is available in the data warehouse of most stores. Now, similarly, the marketing department of the firm may have conducted some surveys or experiments to understand customer preferences, and then that data can potentially be used to understand why sales may have dipped. Okay, so secondary data could be external to the firm as well. Such data can come from third parties like trade organizations, publications in the trade, or academic press, public releases, or government publications like the census data. Now, examples of third-party companies that track and sell secondary data are AC Nielsen, IRI, etc., who employ panel of consumers to track their behavior not only in consumer packaged goods, but also other categories. Now, in contrast to secondary data, we have primary data. Now, sometimes the information that you need to answer the question or questions you may have may not exist, right? So, in this case, the company, or the firm, or you as a manager will need to engage in a data collection exercise targeted primarily to answer the questions of interest. And this is where qualitative analysis techniques comes in. Okay. Now, there are different ways of gathering data to get some insights on the questions that we want answered. Now, we want to understand these techniques because companies spend a lot of time on these techniques to gather information. Now, often the information, qualitative analysis, this information for qualitative analysis may not be enough to generate the insights that we want to seek. They can serve as an input to the quantitative analysis to generate some insights. Okay. Now, most of the qualitative analysis that is conducted can be classified into three categories. So it could be a phenomenological research. As the name suggests, analysis of this type is focused on understanding or establishing phenomena. Okay. For example, how consumers go about making a purchase decision, what they look for, etc. So this class of research essentially is about documenting the existing phenomena in the marketplace. Now, the other class of qualitative analysis is more exploratory in nature. With this approach, there is no singular question that is guiding the data collection exercise, but the data collected in the process can then be analyzed using some of the quantitative techniques we will discuss later to generate some insights. So, for example, in the process of conducting exploratory research, we might find that many consumers prefer to shop online while others prefer to purchase in brick and mortar stores. Now, the next class of techniques, which falls under the umbrella of clinical research, attempts to find the rationale for the facts that have been established earlier through phenomenological research or exploratory research. So this kind of research allows us to answer questions like why consumers behave the way they do, why is that some consumers prefer to shop online while some prefer to not to shop in store, and what drives these differences in their preferences. Okay, so there are several approaches to doing qualitative research. Now, perhaps the most pervasive of the qualitative research methods is focus groups. Okay, so the idea here is to get together a group of people that represent your target population and share the characteristics of your target market, right? And then you ask them questions depending on the nature of your research, exploratory, clinical, etc. So these questions are typically moderated by a person who is professionally trained to conduct the focus group. Now, the responses from the consumers are then recorded and analyzed and may serve as input to other research methods. So, for example, the focus group may be conducted to understand what attributes of the store draw them to visit a particular store. Okay, so through the focus group, one might learn that the store ambience and convenience, the assortment that the store carries, etc., might be important factors that drive store choice. Now, this information can then be used to design a survey, which, as we will see shortly, can be used as a construct to perceptual map. Okay, so we can use this to construct a perceptual map, which in turn can serve as a useful aid, okay, in making some other marketing mix decisions as well. Now, while focus groups gather information by explicitly asking questions to consumers that participate in the focus group, observations are a more subtle way of drawing similar inferences. Okay, so observational approaches allow consumers to operate naturally without the feeling of being observed. And many stores have one-sided mirrors with cameras or analysts sitting on the other side observing customers pushing their shopping carts in the store, or how placement of products on the shelves affects the consumer behavior. Now, observations overcome one of the limitations of focus groups in that they're not intrusive. Okay, so the observation is when you're not going after your customer. Okay, so this is observational learning. So they're not intrusive. So customers go about their business naturally without feeling the need to really distort their behavior to please the observer, because they do not even know that they are being observed. Okay, so in contrast with focus groups, consumers might behave in a manner to merely please the moderator. So there is also a software that helps stimulate or simulate actually a virtual shopping environment. And with this, consumers feel like they are in store and they go about conducting their business as they would in a real store. Now, this information can again be analyzed to gain insights on how consumers behave, and then the product placement and other elements of marketing mix can be optimized using these insights. So this observational learning is something which is less biased as long as the consumer does not have to worry about someone watching them while they're doing it. Now, another approach to gathering data is surveys. This is the area of research where firms tend to spend the most money in the class of qualitative research methods. Now, surveys typically have several questions pertaining to the goal of the study. So we will look at some survey questions in a bit, but an example of a survey question might be whether a particular store has fast checkout, and the consumer might be asked to respond on a 7-point scale. So there are different types of surveys, and they can be conducted on the phone by a person employed by the company or a market research company working on behalf of a firm, wherein the person asks the respondent a series of questions and records their responses. Now, surveys are also conducted by mail or hosted online on, for example, SurveyMonkey, which employs a panel of consumers to respond to a variety of surveys. Surveys are also conducted online, okay, which is it's a very efficient way of collecting information. So, for example, if you're browsing, a pop-up might show up asking you to fill out a survey in exchange for a chance to enter a sweepstake. So they kind of incentivize the customers as well. Now, the trade-off typically across the different ways of conducting surveys is costs versus the degree of control that we have in gathering the information. Personal or phone interviews give the person the most control over the respondent, but are also the most expensive way of gathering information. Now, in contrast, surveys conducted via mail or online surveys are significantly less expensive, but suffer from low response rate. Because respondents may simply just throw the survey in the trash, or they may not even respond to certain questions because they're not clear. Okay, so there is some loss of control when you're conducting surveys in this manner. Now, panels is another approach to collect and track data, where a set of consumers record their behavior over an extended period of time. And this is essentially the approach used by companies like IRI and AC Nielsen that I mentioned earlier, who actually employ consumers to be part of a panel. So in the case of packaged goods, these companies will give the members of the panel a gadget to scan the purchases that they make on every shopping trip that the household makes. Now, this allows IRI and AC Nielsen to log and track the purchases of the members of the panel over time. So once the date of the purchase is recorded, this can then be matched with the store's records to figure out the prices, whether there was any promotion offered by that store in that week, or a feature or a display. Okay, so once this is done, the analysts can employ statistical models and perform quantitative analysis to study the impact of marketing mix actions of brands and their competition on their sales, effect of competition on the sales or on consumers' brand choice decisions, etc. Now, finally, we have experiments, which are a useful way of gathering data. Okay, so with experiments, again, there are several issues that one needs to be aware of. So in typical experiment, there will be some kind of manipulation. Okay, so there will be some kind of manipulation, say a marketing action, and then we want to find out whether that action has the desired impact on consumer behavior, in such a way whether they have a more favorable attitude towards a brand over watching an ad, or a pharmaceutical company might be interested in finding out whether a drug has the intended effect on the patient or not. Okay, so let's take the pharmaceutical company's example. Say Bayer is interested in finding out whether aspirin cures headaches. So the way the lab experiment would be set up is that you create two groups of people with headaches who are identical in all aspects to the extent possible. Now, because it is in a lab, the setting is artificial but controlled. Okay, so one of the groups is what is called the control group. Now, this group receives the placebo or the sugar pill with no active ingredient, while the other group receives manipulation or the drug with the active ingredient. Now, in this case, the response of the two groups is then compared. If there is a significant difference in the relief, that the manipulated group feels relative to the control group, then we can infer causality. That is, we can conclude that the difference in response across the two groups must be due to aspirin. Because an attempt is made to keep all the same across, so everything else across the groups is the same. So the ability to reliably attributing the effect to the manipulation is possible. Okay, so the relief to the administration of the drug is because experiments are in a very controlled environment. Now, lab experiments are therefore high on internal validity. Now, whether or not these results generalize to the real world, where there might be other factors at work, is related to the issue of external validity. That is, when the controls placed in the experimental setting are relaxed, can we still expect the similar results? Okay. Now, firms also conduct field experiments, such as in a city, which are more real. Okay, so which are conducted in a more realistic environment. Now, these experiments have high external validity, but they suffer from low internal validity. Okay, why these experiments have high external validity? Because they are they are conducted in the real world, keeping all kinds of noise in context. So what I want to do now is spend some time talking about some of the quantitative research methods. So I want to begin with correlation analysis, which is a way of relating two variables of interest. So this is a technique that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. So I will keep this discussion brief. Then I want to review a technique called regression analysis, which some of you might also be familiar with. And then I want to provide a short overview of a multivariate technique called factor analysis, which is a data reduction technique. And I want to show you how this can be used to construct a perceptual map. Now, which, as we know, is a very useful tool. When you want to know the positioning of your product, this is actually a tool that comes in very handy, okay? So we will conclude with a brief discussion of how we can forecast market potential and sales. So let's first start looking at some of the data. Now here is an example of a catalog company. The company has two different types of catalogs, catalog A and catalog B. And there are two types of customers, new and old. Customers that have been acquired by the company in the last 6 months are labeled new, and the remaining are labeled old. So the manager of this company is interested in whether there is any relationship between the type of the customer and the catalog that they purchase from. So to answer this question, the manager pulls out 50 new and 50 old consumers and examines the catalog that they purchase from. Now with the data the manager pulled out, we find that all consumers purchase from catalog B. Now if we ask this question, if is there a relationship between the customer type and the catalog that they purchase from based on the data, the answer is pretty obvious, right? So this y-axis on this plot represents the percentage of customers that purchase from catalog A, and the data in the table on the previous slide tells us that 100% of the new customers purchase from catalog A and 0% of old customers purchase from catalog B. So it seems like a perfect relationship. So whenever you get a perfect relationship like this, you should wonder whether there is anything goofy about the data. In fact, the manager pulls out more data, right? In this case, we have data on 1,000 old and 1,000 new customers, and that is what he finds out, okay? So the inference from this data is now completely the opposite of the inference of the previous data, okay? Because you have more data now, right? So you have more observations. Why do we say that? If you stare at this table, we can conclude that the type of the customer tells us nothing about catalog that they are likely to purchase from, okay? So this is regardless of the type of the customer, old or new. They're equally likely to purchase from catalog A or B, which is in direct contrast to our earlier finding, where new customers were likely to purchase from catalog A with certainty. So the manager is not convinced of this either. So he pulls out the entire data set, okay, and finds that the truth is something in between these two pictures, the pictures that I showed in the previous slide. The relationship isn't perfect, as in the first picture, nor it is completely independent. So this table suggests that if you are a new customer, you're more likely, okay, you are more than 5 times likely to purchase from catalog A than from B. While if you are an old customer, then you're roughly 7 times more likely to purchase from B than from catalog A. So the actual relationship between the type of customer and the percentage that purchase, the percentage of customers that purchase from catalog is not perfect, and there is clearly a relationship between the two variables. So this idea of the relationship between two variables is summarized in the correlation coefficient. So the correlation coefficient R is a statistical measure of the strength of the relationship between the two variables. So the correlation can take any value between -1 and +1, because this coefficient lies between -1 and +1. So we have to take into account two factors in interpreting the correlation. So one is the sign, which can be positive or negative. If it is positive, then the relationship between two variables is direct. So for example, if I increase advertising, the sales will generally go up, and if I decrease advertising, sales will go down. So these two variables essentially move in the same direction, and therefore they're positively related. In contrast, if the sign is negative, that suggests an inverse relationship. Okay, so for example, If price is lowered, sales will go up, and if price is increased, sales will go down. Okay, so in this case, the movement of the two variables is in opposite directions. Now, the other thing of importance here is the magnitude of the correlation. That can take any value between 0 and 1. So the closer the correlation is to 1, the stronger the relationship is, while the closer it is 0, the weaker the relationship. So the magnitude of the correlation coefficient represents the strength of the relationship. And the sign of the correlation tells us whether they are directly related, positively or inversely related. So now one of the key learning points from the 3 pictures that we saw earlier is that we should know our data well. We should know our data well before drawing any conclusions about the relationship between the variables that we are interested in. And the inferences that we drew from the first 2 samples were not consistent with that from the entire data. Now, one reason for that might be that the data may have been sorted in a certain way. So when the manager pulled out 50 or 500 of each type in the first 2 cases, the sample was not representative of the population data. Now, that is the reason why experts advocates the use of random samples, so that the sample we use to base our inferences from represent the behavior of the population and do not bias our inferences in any specific way. Now, one of the problems, I guess I shouldn't say a problem, but rather a limitation of correlation analysis is that it only permits us to draw inferences about relationship between a pair of variables, say price and sales or advertising and sales. But we know that both affect sales, right? So we might be interested in the effect or the relationship between both price and advertising and other factors that affect sales. Now that is we might want to relate one outcome, variable, sales, to many variables. So there may be sales that is maybe a dependent variable that the sales may actually depend on many variables such as price, advertising, competitors' price, and advertising on the focal brand sales. Okay, so this is one limitation that regression analysis overcomes, which is a limitation of your correlation when you just do correlation. Now, regression analysis also allows us to quantify the effect of a unit change in one of the explanatory variables on the dependent variables.